Thank you. Good morning. Hello and welcome to this webinar on taking action in fundraising frauds, presented as part of the Charity Fraud Awareness Week. Charity Fraud Awareness Week brings together everyone involved in the charity and not-for-profit sectors to raise awareness and share good practice in tackling fraud and financial crime. We encourage you to share this webinar with any of your other colleagues and resources going forward to help in tackling fraud. If you're joining us live, we encourage you to ask questions throughout this webinar. Questions can be submitted at any time using the Q&A box on screen. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. And we'll strive to answer as many of these questions as possible. We have 10 minutes at the end of the webinar to address those questions. So I will introduce myself for those of you that don't know me. I am a trustee director for the Fraud Advisory Panel. And I am also a partner at EY, and I lead our forensic practice there, where I specialize in investigations and compliance related to fraud and financial crime. And here with us this morning, we have two speakers who are going to talk to us about tackling fraud. The first is Ashley Fairbrother. He is a senior associate at Edmonds, Marshall, and McMahon. And Ashley has unique experience specializing in privately prosecuting defendants in criminal courts on the behalf of clients who have been victims of fraud, cybercrime, and intellectual property crime. He's typically instructed by corporates, charities, and individuals to assist in the investigation and prosecution of suspected fraudsters. He is also an experienced civil litigator and uses a combined skill set to find innovative ways to maximize the potential recovery of assets for clients. And Ashley has had significant experience in restraint and confiscation, having dealt with the largest confiscation order, £21 million, ever awarded in a private prosecution. Our other speaker is Bob Browell, who's the counter fraud manager at Macmillan Cancer Support. He has over 35 years of experience in investigating, managing, and reporting fraud in the public sector. He is a CFE with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and is a qualified accredited counter-fraud specialist with Portsmouth University. During his career, Bob worked for several government departments before rising to become the head of counter-fraud for Skills Funding Agency. Prior to leaving the civil service, he also worked closely with the Government Office and the National Fraud Authority for providing advice and guidance in their initiative to eliminate fraud in the public sector. So we have some really great experience in our panel this morning that will be sharing their different aspects of tackling action in fundraising fraud. And the things that we want to cover this morning is how to use the criminal justice system to seek and recover money, also some options and strategies that are available to charities, as well as going through some case study examples. Again, please submit your questions as we go along, and we will address those at the end. With that, I will hand it over to Ashley.
Well, thank you all for joining us here. Hopefully, Bob and I are going to speak to you about something that's unique and broaden your horizons on things you may not have otherwise been aware of. So as Rachel said, I work for Edmonds, Marshall and McMahon, which was the first and only specialist private prosecution law firm in the country in 2012 that was set up by 3 state prosecutors that became disenfranchised with state prosecutions that they couldn't take on all of the cases they wished to. And so set up a firm taking on cases for corporates, charities, individuals, and prosecuting cases privately through them. So what is a private prosecution? Many of you may be more familiar with the scenario as a victim of fraud, where you would report the case to the police in the usual way, and the police would then decide whether there was a sufficient case there or not, and refer it to the Crown Prosecution Service. So simply put, a private prosecution is any prosecution that is not brought by either the Crown or the CPS or any state body. Now, we're one of the only few jurisdictions in the world that allows victims of crime to effectively stand in the shoes of the Queen and to privately prosecute cases in the court on her behalf. So it's become an increasingly popular remedy amongst charities, corporates and individuals as the state has retrenched through austerity and lack of resources. who brings private prosecutions? Now, here are a few of our clients that we've brought cases for over the years, or who have brought private prosecutions in their own right. Macmillan being one of the latest charities that have taken up the initiative. There are other charities that we're working with and that are also bringing prosecutions in their own right, and have found that having reported cases to the police, that they haven't got a sufficiently robust response, and that they've decided to take on the case themselves. And as I've said, why the need for private prosecutions? I imagine all of the people here have got their own stories where they've been down to the local police station or called up the local police officer and asked them to come down and investigate fraud, and it's simply gone nowhere. And so since 2009, there's been a 14% reduction in police numbers. And fraud is one of the most under-prosecuted cases that is reported to the police. I think there are still a number of police departments or services in the country that don't have even one economic fraud investigator. And so if you ever do go to a police station, you'll know that they tell you to report it to action fraud. And many cases are not reported to action fraud. The vast majority are not. But those that are, 96% of cases that are reported to action fraud go unresolved. So of the small amount of fraud that is reported there, an even smaller amount of that is actually investigated and solved. And why do the police say that they can't investigate? Well, there are a number of reasons why. Lack of resources, it's a civil matter, that part of the element of the offence is not met, or there's been a delay and they can't investigate. And so with that, I'll hand over to Bob, who can speak from experience.
Thank you, Ashley. The first case I'd like to talk about briefly is a chap called Paul Stocks. Now, this case clearly demonstrates the benefit of a private prosecution. This case first came on my desk back in 2017. As a pub landlord, he raised £2,000 and failed to pay Macmillan. Despite efforts to write to him, ultimately in 2018, I reported the matter to the police. For the best part of 2 years, the police couldn't locate Paul Stocks, even though I knew where he was, but that's another story. Therefore, the case withered on the vine at that particular point. Oddly enough, Paul Stocks was picked up for a minor offence, which enabled the police to interview him regarding the Macmillan donation. He maintained he had mounting debts, forgot the money was in his account, and the money was used to pay certain direct debits. Surprisingly, the police took the view at the time, on that basis, there was no dishonesty. Now, I was informed there is currently insufficient evidence available for any realistic prosecution of a conviction. Geared up this frustration, essentially, back in 2019, I first come across private prosecutions and working with the EMM. So in July of that year, 2020, I referred the matter to EMM to take forward. On the 9th of September, well, I should say on the 9th of September, the judge remarked, "You should be under no illusion that your liberty is at jeopardy in this case. This is a particularly serious offence involving a deserved charity, and there is every prospect you will go to prison." At that point, he was under probation, but ultimately was sentenced to 26 weeks custodial sentence, suspended for 2 years, with a condition of 200 hours unpaid work. As I mentioned, in passing sentence, the magistrate commented that this was a very serious matter, and ultimately he also had to pay Macmillan the £2,000 as a compensation order. So that clearly demonstrates the benefits, in my view, of private prosecutions.
And that's a particularly stark example of a case where a police officer has taken the view that there was no dishonesty and no crimes taking place, and then had the case for 2 years and taken no action. And the case was privately prosecuted in 2 months, and the district judge took an entirely different view to that of the police. And it's a prime example of, had the case not been privately prosecuted, the charity would have seen no justice for the crime that was committed against it at all. So there are a couple of ways you can go about skinning a cat through a private prosecution. The first is where you can instruct a firm of lawyers to write to the defendant to ask him to attend an interview under caution. And that might be conducted in exactly the same way that the police might conduct it. And that might be conducted by the investigator at the charity, someone in compliance, or someone with the skills or knowledge of the case to do it. That is a good example. It's a good example to do that where you've not been able to get much of a response from the defendant. You've not really been able to understand what his defence is and why he's decided not to pay the money that he's raised to the charity. And that will give you an opportunity to assess what his answer is to the allegation, to make him understand the seriousness of the allegation, and to bring him to the table. In many cases, when an external independent law firm write to a defendant to explain that they are a firm of prosecutors, this is a criminal offence and they could go to prison for what's happened, it might be that's what causes them to put their ears up and decide to pay the money back. In other cases where the investigator, like Bob or some of his colleagues who investigated the case thoroughly, have received an answer from the defendant that they're not happy with, and they've pursued all avenues to recover the money, you might simply go straight to a criminal prosecution. And there's no need for you to carry out an interview like the police might do. And so Bob's going to talk you through an example of each of those options and where they came in useful.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, as Ashley mentioned, apart from directly doing private prosecutions through the magistrates court, we have had success with these IUC letters. One particular case, the first one that happened, we had a supporter who purchased a table of 10 at the Dorchester Christmas event, raising £3,000. That money was never forthcoming. Many attempts were made to obtain the payment by our events manager, our finance team, and other staff. Eventually, the matter was referred to myself. By this time, it was difficult to find this particular chap. It's sort of gone to ground. Ultimately, I did some research, did a bit of walking around Westminster and Victoria, and I discovered who his accountant was. So I went to his accountant's office and basically contacted him via his own accountant. He then again promised to pay the £3,000. Money was never forthcoming. Come November 2019, 12 months after the event occurred, I spoke to Ashley, referred the matter to EMM. They wrote to this particular individual. I must admit, it's a very professional letter, very direct, and all the efforts we'd made in 12 months to get the money had come to nothing. But the production of this letter sent to him, and he paid the money, the outstanding donation of £3,000 within 2 weeks. So I'll say that was a quick result. We obtained the donation, and we didn't have to go to court. And that's not the only case that's happened in.
And there are other charities we work with where we've taken a similar approach and written to the defendants, and they've tried their level best to persuade the defendant to pay the money in, and it's simply not been forthcoming, and following a sort of external letter that they've decided to pay the money. And that doesn't mean to say that there's no criminal offence after someone's decided to pay the money on the back of a legal letter setting out the potential consequences of failing to pay that money. It's still very much a criminal offence, but it is then in the charity's power to decide whether they wish to continue to carry on prosecuting the offender, whether they wish to carry on the interview, or whether they wish to effectively call it quits at that stage. And we've had clients go in different options depending on the facts of the individual case. So another, where you've exhausted all avenues and you've decided that the defendant's given you an answer. There are various answers we've had over the years from defendants of the cases we've prosecuted. Bob's took the view in his experience that it isn't sufficient and that the case should proceed to a prosecution. And the question is how is a private prosecution conducted? Well, I should first make clear, because there's been a string of authorities over the summer where prosecutions have gone wrong, as more and more people are doing them, there is more scope for them to go wrong. So they are very difficult, but experience in prosecuting and experience specifically in private prosecuting is absolutely key. And as I said, we've been doing it now solely as a specialist firm for 10 years. And so we've been through all the hoops and the challenges that other firms that are now taking on are starting to go through. And we're now starting to see judgments in the court of what can go wrong if it's not done properly. So the how depends on the client. And if it's a charity or a corporate victim, they may have conducted an investigation themselves and already uncovered the extent of the offending. Or they may have received intelligence in relation to the offending that requires further investigation, either by us, or we can advise on what further investigation needs to be conducted. And so we'll often get involved at an early stage. And the relationship we have now with Macmillan and other charities are that at the outset of a case where they think it's likely to go down the fraud route, they'll pick up the phone to us, we'll have a conversation and decide whether it is a tenable criminal case. We'll have a discussion about what potential lines of inquiry need to be conducted and what further evidence needs to be obtained. And Bob and his colleagues will go and obtain those statements and come back. So the investigation may require the gathering of further witness statements or exhibits. And as I say, we can do that, or Bob will do that. And it's at that stage people decide usually that they have a viable case, they can refer to the police. And it may well be that they refer it to the police and they've done it in the past and nothing much happens. But having this knowledge of what other options you have is then key. And knowing that you can prosecute yourselves even when you've been rebuffed from the police is important. So the file that's obtained then from Bob and his colleagues is sent to me or one of my colleagues, and we're prosecutors. That's what we do, and we will review the evidence and decide whether there's sufficient evidence to prosecute. And we apply what's called the full code test. And now the full code test is a two-pronged test, which is that there's sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction and that it is in the public interest to prosecute. Now, it might seem reasonably clear that if you've stolen money from a charity or any type of charity, but particularly a cancer charity, that it's always going to be in the public interest, whatever the value, to prosecute those that decide to engage themselves in that way. So that's usually not a difficult hurdle. Albeit, having said that, we have had cases where it has been slightly tricky. The first part of the test is that there's sufficient evidence, and that is sufficient evidence that a jury properly directed will convict the defendant. We will apply that test. It's the same test that the state apply in their prosecutions. So there's no difference between you prosecuting privately and the state prosecuting. The same thresholds of success will apply and the same test will apply. At that stage, I'll go back to Bob or the charity and say, yeah, we agree and we take the view that the full code test is met. This is a case we should prosecute. And then we simply write, in effect, a letter, and it's called laying in information at the local magistrate's court. And we tell the local magistrate that this is an offence. Here are the elements of the offence. Here is an outline of the evidence. Can we have a first hearing date? They'll usually give a first hearing date in about 3-4 weeks' time after we've written the letter. So it's very quick justice. It's not like county court cases where you might be waiting years for a hearing date. The courts recognise the seriousness of these cases and they get listings relatively quickly. The magistrate or the district judge will then look at the evidence that we've submitted and he'll decide whether the elements of the offence are met, whether whether it's vexatious. There have been private prosecutions that have been brought with bad motives. It's unlikely to apply in a charity case. And he'll then decide whether a summons should be granted. The summons will be usually granted, and the summons will say to a defendant, you must turn up on this day, and if you don't, you may be arrested, or you will be arrested. And Bob and I have had a lot of luck in having the defendants turn up to hearings. We have had a case last week where the defendant didn't turn up to court. The warrant is then issued by the magistrate, sent to the local police station, and now the next time this person tries to go on holiday or is picked up, they'll be arrested and brought to the magistrate's court. But before it ever gets to that stage, we'll often work with the police, and the police will go and turn up at someone's house or workplace, and they'll arrest them there, bring them to the magistrate's court. And if you're very unlucky and it happens on a Friday, you might be in, or Saturday, you might have to spend a couple of nights in prison until the Monday. So there is a lot of seriousness to these orders, and people usually turn up, but there are some cases where they don't. And at that stage, at the first hearing, the defendant has the option of whether to plead guilty or not. And again, we've had quite good luck, and I think the luck is arisen out of the thorough investigation by Bob and the thorough review of the evidence by our firm as prosecutors, that many defendants plead guilty at the first hearing, and that's effectively the end of the case. They can be sentenced on that day or sentenced a few weeks later after they've spoken to probation. Many cases they've decided to pay the money back either at the morning of the hearing or shortly after the hearing. So the charity's been paid their money back, the defendant's been sentenced, and that's it, you can move on. There are some cases where they decide to plead not guilty, and they have that right, and then it will be sent to trial, and the jury or the local magistrate, if it stays in the magistrate's court, will decide on guilt. So that is in effect how it works, and it's a lot more straightforward than people realise. So in respect of Macmillan, as I've said, other charities have added private prosecutions to their toolkit when it comes to fighting fraud, and one of those is Macmillan. Why did Macmillan take this route, and why did they prosecute? Well, as we all know, Macmillan provide vital support to those diagnosed or suffering from cancer, principally from the money that's raised from fundraising, to those who collect money from the general public. And every penny has far-reaching consequences for those people that need Macmillan support. So every £28 that's stolen could have paid for a nurse to go and help someone that's receiving palliative care or dying from cancer, or to support their families when they're in their most desperate hours. And so as a result of that, all donations, however small, are significant, as they are to all charities, whatever they do. And a considerable amount of trust is then placed upon the integrity of that fundraiser by both Macmillan and by both the people that are donating. And unfortunately, there are people who abuse that trust. And so that's why Macmillan have taken a robust view for the benefit of their supporters to prosecute those. And as I said, it doesn't have to be the £1 million cases that you might have read about in the press. These can be reasonably low-level frauds that people think they might get away with. So if I hand over to Bob to speak about a few case studies.
Thank you, Ashley. I think the sad truth is that from my experience, and I've been with Macmillan for 5-6 years, the charity sector is seen as a soft touch by potential fraudsters. Just to put this into context, I'm going to speak about 2 or 3 cases or successful cases Macmillan have had. But we did our first private prosecution in September 2019. As of today, we've conducted 18 private prosecutions, and we've had convictions and guilty pleas in 17 out of those 18 cases. So the success rate is phenomenal, and we're getting justice for our supporters. Moving on to one example, a landlady called Jan Coates. These names are in the public domain, by the way, because they've appeared on the front page of local newspapers and national press. But this particular landlady, she had held us as a charity of the year back in 2017. She had merchandise from us, from badges, balloons, collection tins, buckets. During the year, she had name a beer, donate 50p a pint, darts marathon, music festivals, quizzes, days at the races, afternoon teas, various functions. Ultimately, we could prove that she raised in excess of £1,500. Despite contacting her over 2 years, no money was ever paid to us. Ultimately, so through EMM, we did a private prosecution, and she was ultimately pleaded guilty and found guilty and convicted. She received 150 hours unpaid work, a victim surcharge. The stolen money was recovered in full and ordered to pay the prosecution costs. The odd thing is, on the back of our particular case, this particular landlady had held other charities like Help the Heroes as her charity of the year, previous years and subsequent years. Well, on the back of our success, those charities became aware that they had not had the money from her, and they approached her. And rather than go to court again, because she's on a suspended sentence, those charities received the outstanding donations that hadn't been paid in previous years. If we move on to next slide, yeah. A second case, a lady called Yvonne Khan. For 7-8 years, she had been obtaining goods from supermarkets, shops, members of the public, and going to car boot sales across the Midlands for many years. One of our supporters, who had seen her a couple of times, was just generally suspicious, and on one occasion she had sellotaped a certificate to her stall. Anyway, this particular supporter, with his concerns, took video footage, an image of this particular letter, and contacted Macmillan. We discovered we had a record for her, but she hadn't paid us a penny. And the letter that she had, sort of say, stuck to the table of her stall had been falsified. Ultimately, she went to court, pleading not guilty, but at the trial she was found guilty. Ultimately sentenced to 6 months, suspended for 2 years. There was a condition that she can't attend any more car boot sales for 2 years, and a 10-day rehabilitation activity requirement. Oddly enough, again, it happens on several cases. When the cases hit the press, we tend to get more information that we wish we knew beforehand. For example, we had intelligence that she'd been defrauding Macmillan, not 8 years, but getting on for 15, 16 years. She also went to Walsall Football Club every home game and had a stall on the back on raising money from Macmillan. We knew nothing about that. And it got to a point that when she went to the football club for the home games, she had to take a car with a trailer because she was so well known and popular. She'd be given more goods to sell than she sold on the day. So she needed a trailer to take the goods home. And then we were tipped off about eBay accounts, online buying and selling sites. Her income was phenomenal. We really don't know at the end of the day how much she did defraud from Macmillan. And then ultimately, we understand that she was also being taken to court by the DWP, and she had identity thefts for 2 other people and benefit fraud, but that's another story. But that was Yvonne Khan. A third one was a chap called Jason Starr. He was a landlord at a pub in Norwich. And he got probably about seven people in the pub to hold a joint brave the shave. That took place, and then what he did was he took a photograph of all 7 having their head shaved, and then created a thank you letter from Macmillan thanking us for the £1,003.50. This certificate or this letter and the pictures were put in a frame and placed above the bar in the pub. One of the drinkers or one of the locals in the pub, again, was suspicious. He reported his concerns to Macmillan. That came on my desk, and yet again we discovered that, yeah, we were aware of Jason's staff, but he hadn't paid us any money. And he certainly hadn't had a thank you letter. We wrote to him, recorded delivery like we normally do. He never responded. Through Ashley, they sent out a local private detective who took a picture of the framed certificate and picture of the people having the braver shave. And ultimately, we took him to court, and he was found guilty, similar as before, a 6-month custodial sentence, suspended for 2 years. He was given a curfew from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. from the 4th of July, from when he was convicted for 12 months. And ultimately, we reported the matter to the local council, the local licensing part of the council, and he had his license withdrawn, so no longer landlord. So that's a third example. Just moving on, just to give you an idea of the outcomes or the benefits, should we say. Clearly, as I've mentioned, we've had 17 successful convictions, and we've obtained justice. And I don't believe we'd have obtained that justice through the police, but I accept they have their own problems, resources, and things like that. And this is a way of getting justice. Unpaid donations, obviously, they get repaid. Defendants are required to pay in compensation orders. The suspended custodial sentences. They receive community service orders, banning orders, and we've had a couple of convicted defendants being tagged and curfewed, one that I mentioned. And ultimately, defendants are required to pay the costs and compensation. So it's a benefit all the way around as an outcome. Personal reflections. What did I just mention? It's not just for Macmillan and myself and the people who do this, but I actually see the faces of those supporters who contact me, who've donated money for Brave the Shaves, coffee mornings. It's justice for them and the supporter satisfaction. And just to give you an idea, we've had 2 or 3 cases where that satisfaction has shone through, where grateful donors have held additional fundraising events for Macmillan because we were defrauded. Now, I know we obtained successful convictions, but that has generated goodwill, supporter satisfaction, and further fundraising events, and continues to do so. The recovery costs, in round terms, means on an annual basis, the amount of money we recover pays for the running costs of Macmillan's counter-fraud team. And let's not get carried away. The counter-fraud team is myself and one other. It's not a team, but it's 2 of us. But it pays that. So Macmillan take the view we're a source of income, and they're getting a counter-fraud function free, in a sense. Recovered donations support Macmillan's charitable objectives. It gets recycled. I believe it enhances the reputation in the charity sector and the charity commission that actually the charity sector is fighting back. And the profile of fraud awareness within Macmillan has gone off the Richter scale, from the chief executive, trustees, right down to members of staff. And as we've said, other charities are now coming forward as victims and now taking action, and they're now looking at taking on board private prosecutions. And it's been the bottom line for Macmillan, it's been a huge success. Thank you, Ashley.
And so very lastly, I think we're coming to the end of our time now, so I'll just touch on very briefly the costs, but just picking up on one of Bob's point about the way that fraud is considered in his reflections. I think, in my experience with speaking to any corporates or charities, that fraud is always quite a difficult subject to discuss. People are always a bit scared of putting their head above the parapet and saying, "Oh, we've been the victim of a fraud," and prosecuting someone for it. It's a very scary thought, and comms teams are very wary of taking that step. And this is just showing, I hope, to many of you and certainly to Macmillan, that it shouldn't be a scary subject to discuss. It should be something that people take pride stopping for the members and their supporters. And certainly we've seen a change in view of many comms teams we've spoken to and the trustees. But in terms of cost, very briefly, you might be all wondering how do you pay for all of this? Surely it's going to be very expensive. But there are two ways that you can recover your funds. One is from the defendant, where they've clearly got the means to do so. So the landlords that have been pilfering away from charities for years and clearly had a lot of money to pay the money back, they're able to pay the prosecution costs. Usually they do so very quickly, and they certainly pay the money they've stolen back very quickly because they want to try and avoid the prospect of going to prison. So that's the first way. The second way is that you are entitled to recover your legal costs and investigation costs from something called central funds. And the principle for that's state funds. The principle for that is that because you've had to incur the cost yourself of achieving justice that should be publicly available for everyone, you should be recompensed for that cost. And so the general rule is, and there's a strong purposive interpretation, is that you'll get the vast amount of your money back. And the Lord Chancellor himself, who was involved in the case not long ago, said that through his counsel that charities and people similar to that carry out private prosecutions should expect to receive the majority, if not all, of their legal costs back. There are circumstances where the court might think that it's inappropriate to award your costs. We've not had that in any of our cases, and it'd be difficult to envisage a case in respect of a charity where the court found that it wasn't appropriate to recompense their money back. In the one case where there was a acquittal, it was a difficult case, it was a carefully judged and managed case, but even in that case, after a jury acquitted a defendant, the judge still said you should be entitled to recover your costs back from central funds. And the idea is that you shouldn't be motivated to secure someone's conviction by the prospect of recovering your costs. You should do so fairly. And that's why it isn't dependent on the outcome of the prosecution whether you get your money back. So with that, I'll hand back over to you, Rachel.
I'd like to thank you both for all of your time and effort in pulling together this really fascinating discussion. This is something that is really important to everyone who has attended today. And this webinar will be available on demand from our website, preventcharityfraud.org.uk. And you'll also find some other useful resources to help you manage the risk of fraud. They're being shown on screen now. We are just going to put up a survey on screen to gather your feedback about this webinar. We're always looking for ways that we can do this a bit better. So please do take a few minutes to fill in the survey. And thank you so much for your time today. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.